biomass hit a record low since the early 2010s, and that again aligns with that period of depressed reproductive success by gannets at Cape St. Mary's. And then also, if you look at sea surface temperature in the foraging range of gannets at Cape St. Mary's over the years, average sea surface temperature in early chick rearings remained steady. So there hasn't really been an influence of temperature during that time period. But in late chick rearing, so August, September, over the years since 1960s, the average sea surface temperatures sort of been encroaching that 15-degree temperature threshold. And that's sort of that temperature threshold that mackerel can't tolerate. So moving forward, it's possible that these conditions will make it even more difficult for gannets to access mackerel in late chick rearing. And then that might have further consequences on reproductive success. So this is sort of a general summary for this chapter. When mackerel availability goes down, breeding success of gannets goes down. So there's just less production of viable offspring each year when mackerel's availability is lower. And then also increased sea surface temperature in early chick rearing is associated with increased reproductive success. So it's possible at this point of the year, so in June, July, increased sea surface temperatures might have a positive influence on available prey. But then in late chick rearing, increased sea surface temperature has a negative influence on gannet reproductive success. So just to move on to my second chapter that I did for my thesis. This was intra and interannual shifts in foraging tactics by parental northern gannets, indicates changing prey fields. And again, this is also published, and I can provide the link to that if anyone's interested in reading it later. But this is the main GPS tracking portion of my work. So the objectives of this work were to determine core foraging areas of parental northern gannets. So this was just to figure out which areas are important for them and their prey. And we also wanted to assess intra and interannual differences in their foraging effort and behavior using these GPS and time depth recorders. So the loggers we put on, they have GPS devices, but that logs the location, but they also have these time depth recorders that logs how deep they're diving and where they're diving. So with that information, we're able to figure out where they're feeding and how that might change within and between years. And we also just wanted to figure out which environmental conditions or prey availability factors might have influenced these differences in foraging behavior. So just for the field methodology, we put these GPS / time depth recorders. From now on, I'll just refer to those as TDRs, just for short. We deployed those on parental northern gannets during the breeding season from July to as long as October in 2019 and 2020. This was for my thesis. We did do 2 additional years of logging in 2021 and 2022, but I just won't be speaking to that year's data right now. So as you can see on the left, this photo here, we put the GPS device on the 4 middle rectrices of the tail feathers of the gannet. And these devices were cool too, because that black box you see there, or black square, is a little solar panel. So we could put that on, and then it would just continuously charge the battery for the rest of the summer that the tag was on the bird. And we didn't need to get these tags back either, because we had this receiver set up that you see me sitting with my laptop with it, wedged into some rocks on the side of the cliff. So we just kind of pointed that receiver at the colony where the gannets were tagged. And then whenever I had the time, I could just walk over, plug my laptop in, and then just download all of the most recent data. So it was really nice because you didn't have to get the GPS device back, which is often the case for other smaller species that you can't fit sort of this advanced technology into the tag. And then eventually the tag will just get molted off with the tail feathers during the non-breeding period. So we had these devices on there for several months, and they recorded location every 15 minutes, and they recorded dive depth every 1 second after submersion during dives. So in total, across those 2 years, we had 506 total foraging trips that we got from 17 different birds. And birds were tracked for 17 to 76 days, and we got 11 to 66 foraging trips per bird. Here's just a lovely photo or video of how you actually catch a gannet. So you use these long sort of telescoping noose poles so that you can access the gannet without getting too close to the rest of them. And here I'll just play the video, but you just kind of slowly wrap it around the neck and then pull it in and then quickly get it off. Probably looks a lot more harsh than it really is. It only takes like a few seconds just to haul them in and get that pole off of their neck. So for the things we're looking for with this data, we analyzed the data from these tags for dive profiles of the gannets, and from that we can kind of infer what species that they might have been foraging on at any given time. And we're also looking at these things called kernel density 50% utilization distributions, which is just fancy jargon to say like a core foraging area where gannets foraged about 50% of the time. Then we also looked at comparisons between and within years of foraging effort. So that just means like foraging trip duration, maximum and total distance, and then the number of dives per trip. And I also looked at proportion of time spent in different behavioral states, but I didn't include that today just for the sake of time. So dive profiles, gannets have two sort of specific dive profiles that they employ when they're going for different species of forage fish. So they have U dives, which is the one you can see on the right of this figure here. These are usually the deeper dives that are more prolonged, and they sort of almost fly underwater, like they flap their wings underwater. And these dives are pretty much exclusively associated with capelin, because capelin are like a smaller, slower moving fish that they can go down and slowly pluck a few out of the water column. And then they also have V dives, which is more of a rapid or shallow dive that's usually associated with those larger fish like mackerel or sorry or herring. And they need to use that sort of rapid shallow dive because mackerel in particular are very fast. So you need to sort of capture them quickly and stun them. You don't have the luxury of sort of going underneath and plucking a few out of the water like you have with capelin. So those dives that are associated with capelin, the U dives, those can be about as deep as 20 to 24 meters underneath the water. And then those V dives are usually in the range of 5 to 10 meters for mackerel or sorry or herring. Excuse me. So we want to look at how the proportion of these different dive profiles changed over time within the breeding season. So in these two figures, so this is just the dive profile proportion per day. So like the percentage of each separate dive profile that they used on a given day. And in the red is the U dives, which are associated with capelin. And then in the green or teal color are those V dives, the more shallow dives that are associated with mackerel and fish such as that. So these U dives are more prominent during early chick rearing in June or July. And then in both years, these kind of tailed off. So that just represents a shift away from using capelin or foraging on capelin earlier in the season to mainly going after those larger fish that move into the region later in the season. And then for future analysis, we just split the breeding season into two different periods based on these dive profile trends, with July 18th to August 15th being early chick rearing. Excuse me. And this was when they were mainly going after capelin with some dives for primarily herring during that time. And then in late chick rearing, they almost didn't use any of those U-dives at all, mainly V-dives, and that was August 16th to October 7th. So just to show, and then yeah, so pre-shift is referring to that early chick rearing period, and then after shift is referring to that late chick rearing period. So these are all just the raw GPS tracks of where the gannets went over those 2 years. So the star there in the middle of the map is Cape St. Mary's, the colony that they're coming from. And then, yeah, so you can see those blue shifts from the pre-shift or early chick rearing in 2019 were a bit closer to the colony than in 2020. And I'll talk more about that briefly. So using all of those raw GPS tracks or those raw data points, we made these 50% core foraging areas. So that those blue polygons there are in early chick rearing, and then the red is in late. So the core foraging ranges where these gannets were foraging 50% of the time in late chick rearing was greater than early chick rearing in 2019, but there wasn't really a noticeable difference in 2020. And then core foraging range in early chick rearing in 2020 was greater than 2019. So there's no difference in late chick rearing between years. So just to speak on why the gannets didn't travel as far in early chick rearing in 2019 compared to 2020, we wanted to look at capelin availability because that was the main prey source during that time period. So all of these black dots were just reported capelin spawning sites that we acquired from this website called eCapelin. It's basically like eBird, but for capelin. Very niche app, that's for sure. But there was fewer reported spawning sites in the gannet foraging range in 2020 compared to 2019. So that just means there was fewer sites where there was available capelin in 2020. And then spawning was also earlier and more variable in 2020. So there was less consistent sources of capelin in 2020 compared to 2019. And this was also reflected in other parts of Newfoundland that year too. We also use these models called generalized linear mix models. I'm not going to go into super great detail about those in terms of what they are, but basically they're statistical models that we use to assess intra and interannual differences in foraging effort. So in other words, just examining the differences between chick rearing periods and years. And the things we were looking at was trip duration, total distance during trips, and the amount of dives per trip. So just for a general summary about this work, there's pretty consistent intra-annual, so within years prey switching, where gannets used a lot of those U-dives and were foraging a lot on capelin during early chick rearing, and those falling out of favor to mainly those V-dives that are associated with mackerel and sorry in late chick rearing. Also, generally, when capelin availability was decreased, foraging effort increased. So the gannets had to work harder during early chick rearing when capelin was less available in order to acquire those feed sources. And just a little bit more of that summary of that chapter. So foraging effort in the form of trip distance, duration, and foraging area was greater in late chick rearing than early chick rearing in 2019, but not 2020. And that just further suggests differing prey availability between those years. So in 2020, they certainly had to travel a lot further in early chick rearing due to that lack of capelin availability, but that wasn't seen in 2019. So that was a more typical year in terms of prey availability in early chick rearing. However, it's also possible that mackerel or sorry also migrated into the region earlier in 2020, and this just made them switch to different prey sooner. So just to sort of synthesize and provide some implications from those two thesis chapters, variable prey availability and environmental conditions impact the foraging ecology and productivity of gannets at Cape St. Mary's. We found that the depletion of critical fish stocks, such as mackerel in the Northwest Atlantic, is likely resulting in lowered gannet reproductive success. And this is likely made worse by warming waters in Lake chick rearing, having a further influence on the availability of mackerel. We also found that decreased capelin availability and more variable spawning timing resulted in greater foraging effort by gannets in 2020 compared to 2019. And this might have explained why there was slightly lower reproductive success in 2020 compared to 2019, as they were working harder to get that food. So that sort of finished my thesis chapter portion of the talk. I have a couple slides here. I just want to show person habitat suitability modeling that I did on contract with Environment Canada about 2 years ago now. I'm not going to go into super great detail, but the figures that result from it are kind of neat. So I just figured I'd show them and discuss those a bit. So habitat suitability modeling, we just created these models with the tracking data from the gannets using data from 2019, 2020, and 2021 to identify critical foraging habitat for the gannets in southeastern Newfoundland. And we used different models for, excuse me, for the U-dives and the early and late U-dives. We were interested in doing that because if you separate the models out into the different dive profiles, you can kind of infer suitable habitat for their prey species as well. In particular, the U-dives are like exclusively associated with capelin, so you can kind of use the models from that to figure out which areas are best for gannets and capelin. And some of the variables we looked at were sea surface temperature, latitude, longitude, distance from colony, bathymetry, and slope of the seafloor. And we were just interested in how that impacted the suitability for foraging habitat of these gannets. So just to skip through all of the work that was involved with that and just show the final figures. You have the U-dive here on the left. So when they were going after capelin, sorry, I should just clarify that this HSI on the far right, that just means habitat suitability index. So the darker that shade is, the more suitable that particular area is for gannet foraging. So for U-dives, this was when they were going after capelin. The habitat that was more suitable was typically closer to shore. And then as you looked at the V-dives, the suitable habitat was usually further away from the shore and in much deeper waters. And now I just wanted to sort of discuss the impacts of avian flu on northern gannets, in particular at Cape St. Mary's in 2022. So I don't know if anyone's super familiar with what avian flu sort of presents like in gannets. I have a small little video. It's not super graphic. It's just sort of the behavioral look of what they look like. So you would usually never see a gannet on the beach like this. If you ever see that, that's your first red flag. But then it sort of presents in gannets where they'll just be kind of looking kind of dumbfounded on the beach. They're very lethargic and they're not really moving very much. The disease presented a lot worse in other species with like really dramatic neurological impacts. But this is what it typically looked like in gannets. So just looking at mortality and colony abandonment at Cape St. Mary's due to the disease. So there's a photo on the left from June 2022, and that's pretty typical of what a bird rock at Cape St. Mary's looks like. So this is just the tall sea stack, and this is just a small subsection of the colony. And it's usually, fully packed with gannets on their nests. But if you look at the photo on the right there for August 2022, by this point, there was quite a lot of mortality. You can't quite see it in that photo, but there were, there's certainly loss, that's for sure. So likely hundreds of adult gannets died to avian flu in 2022, but there's exact counts are sort of undetermined yet. And there was also another slight marine heat wave event that happened in around August 2022. So some of the gannets that are missing could have been from avian flu, and they could have been from the heat wave. So they might have just left because food was hard to acquire due to the sea surface temperature being too warm for their prey. So next summer, there's going to be a lot more efforts by the folks over in Newfoundland to sort of fully quantify the impacts of the disease. And then just looking at breeding success from last year, there's the lowest recorded breeding success value on record at Cape St. Mary's in 2022 associated with the disease and this marine heat wave event. So pretty grim last year, but looking at the road ahead, the full extent of mortality, as I said, in the colony has yet to be fully determined. So they're probably going to do some census and surveys this year to sort of provide an estimate of the proportion of the colony lost. Another key question is it going to continue to be a problem in 2023, or was 2022 sort of the year of impact? And, you know, years after this, you'll see maybe like habituation of the gannets to the disease. So yeah, further efforts will be made to monitor that situation. But looking forward, it's possible that breeding success for the remaining gannets at the colony could improve in the short term, and this would be due to decreased competition for resources as a result of that population loss. So that'll be kind of interesting to look at moving forward to see if they're able to cope and the rest of them will be able to succeed due to that lack of competition. And yeah, that sort of concludes my mashup of various gannet work from the past few years. And these are just the people and organizations that I have to thank for various aspects of the different work I did over the years. And with that, I'll leave it to questions.
I saw one question in the chat from Ken McKenna or Kyle, inquiring the cost on the trackers.
Oh, the cost of the trackers? Yeah, about $1,600 each. Yeah, so at one point during my degree, I had a briefcase with, 10 of these just sitting in the corner of my room. The great thing about them is that no one can really sell them on like the Seabird GPS tracker black market because, no one's going to accept that because it's clearly stolen, so really expensive, but who's going to steal them is my main point.
I also see, that's interesting, from Krista, other seabirds impacted by avian flu?
So quite a few different species. There was this one colony of ring-billed gulls in Newfoundland that completely abandoned their chicks. The whole colony just completely left, and that was presumably due to avian flu. Also, MERS, common MERS, were the species that was arguably hit the hardest. There was a lot of effort on doing survey work on beaches, and there's just hundreds of common MERS washing up in different locations. Also, razorbills, puffins, kittiwakes. We found dovekies that were impacted by it, northern fulmars, great shearwater. Yeah, pretty much everything. Herring gulls, Iceland gulls.
Yeah, absolutely devastating. I see Richard's put a comment up there, Richard Stern. In the season, we'll call it very steady stream of gannets going past Briar. Where are they going from and to?
So the ones that you would see by Briar, it would have to be from any of the colonies in North America. It could be from any single one of them. So there is previous work done on, the migration patterns of gannets from the North American colonies. So they did some work at Cape St. Mary's. They did some work at Bonaventure Island in Quebec, Funk Island in Newfoundland. And they generally overwinter on the southern eastern seaboard, the Gulf of Mexico, and some also overwinter in West Africa, believe it or not. They go across the entire Atlantic Ocean and overwinter off the coast of like Morocco. Yeah.
Cool. I also see we've got a question. What sort of numbers of chicks per pair, shall we say, did the reads? 1 chick, 2 chicks, 3 chicks?
Oh yeah, just one. So a lot of seabirds only lay 1 egg, with the exception of gulls. Gulls will usually lay 2 to 3, but puffins lay 1 egg, gannets lay 1 egg, mares lay 1 egg, storm petrels lay 1 egg. So they usually just have that one shot per year to produce offspring. Although sometimes if they lose the egg early enough in the season, they'll replace it.
Okay. Interesting. Are there any actual smaller colonies in the Maritimes? Anything in Nova Scotia at all? Or are they all just the large colonies that you've got recorded?
Sorry, what was that?
Are there any smaller colonies, anything in Nova Scotia, shall we say, or are it just the large colonies of?
To my knowledge, no. There used to be a few on Gannet Rock outside of Yarmouth, on the coast there. And I believe years prior, there was a lot of effort to try and recolonize that. So they had, I think it was Ted Dion that had a bunch of sort of decoy gannets that they put out there, and they played a bunch of gannet calls off the speaker, sort of in an attempt to get gannets to recolonize, but that never ended up working, sadly. So it's just the six colonies that are known in North America.
Just a quick question if Alex Dontremont's online. Alex, any more background on colonies around the Yarmouth Way? Maybe not.
Yeah, I know he did help Ted with that back in the day.
Okay. Alex doesn't have a mic, so he apologizes. Okay. Avian flu, 100% fatal to the birds, do we know? Or?
No, sadly, we don't really know that. I don't know if there's some efforts going on with some of the Environment Canada folks in Newfoundland. Like one of my bosses when I was working for them, Greg Robertson, he does a lot of work with viruses and disease. So it's probably something they're looking at to sort of see what the total survival rate is, and how that differs between species even. But as far as I know, they don't really have that determined yet.
It was pretty heartbreaking to see a lot of the birds this year. I mean, we had a shearwater in what we call our yard, in other words, Yarmouth Sound, basically dying in the water. It's just really distressing, to say the least. Yeah,
it definitely was not a good year.
Question, anything to do with the Government of Canada, or has your research influenced the Government of Canada's mackerel quota reduction?
Not to my knowledge, no. I have very little influence.
Yeah, we're not going to go there, getting a bit political. Eric's asking, any effect on the eider population with the avian flu?
Eiders have been impacted by it. I'm not sure. It seems in waterfowl, like there isn't as much mortality. Apparently at one point, like nearly every mallard and black duck in St. John's had it, but they were fine with it. So there's sort of like a reservoir. I think there was a little bit of an impact on eider populations in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Quebec, but I don't think it was as severe as the impacts on like gannets or mares.
Okay. I saw Seb Pardo's hand come up. You got a question, Seb?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, Kyle. Super informative, especially in relation to mackerel and the discussions the DFO is having right now about the stock status and the management of the species. One of the key questions I have is, you mentioned that 6% nesting success or breeding success was kind of the critical point, and why is that?
65%. Yeah.
Right.
That was just for sort of, I didn't find that out myself. This was from previous work. I can't quite exactly remember the exact location I pulled that from, but that's just for like maintaining population size. That's what they determined is like the threshold for maintaining that population.
Oh, so basically that below 65, you don't get growth in at least the nesting colony.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the other question I have is, how did you estimate mackerel availability? Was just based on the SSB estimate?
Yeah, I just pulled an SSB values for each of those years that I did had breeding success data for, and I just pulled that out of a some DFO report document. I can't quite remember the exact one right now, but
yeah, so that's really interesting because SSB is based on the whole mackerel population from all the way from Southwest Nova to almost Labrador.
No. So
No?
I only used it for I can't remember. I think it was specifically within like that KLOP region. Or I think it was the northern contingent.
Yeah, so the northern contingent breeds mostly in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, and it spreads around all the way around Newfoundland and down to the Scotian Shelf, which is super interesting because if you find a relationship between that SSB and breeding success, which is like, that SSB is indication of the whole overall health of the stock, you would probably find an even stronger relationship if you had local data. So that's really cool.
Yeah. Sadly, the local data is not available. But
yeah, I know it's really hard, and mackerel vary very much from year to year in each region. They show up in some years, especially in southern and eastern Newfoundland. Some years there's lots of them, and some they're not there. So it's it's. Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this question, Seb.
Got another couple of questions. Brody's asking. He spent some time at Bird Rock in Scotland last August. Should be spectacular. The largest gannet colony out there. They're reporting loss in 2/3 of the population. Any more comments on that?
Yeah, Tony, there was a comment from Mike further up that was asking whether we're seeing the same declines in the European colonies.
Okay, yeah.
I just only know about one because I was there, but I was wondering if Kyle had more to say about that.
Yeah, so like the situation was definitely a lot more dire in Europe. That's where it sort of started and came over from. So there's been papers and studies on like complete sort of devastation of sandwich tern colonies. Like there was tons of mortality, like no successful breeding whatsoever. Yeah, certainly a lot of gannets lost, like you said, at Bass Rock. I know the colony in the middle of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, here on this side, in Great Bird Rock. That's a colony of about 26,000 pairs, so 52,000 birds. And they did a survey in, I can't quite remember when, July or August, but they did like a flyover, and there was more empty space than birds. So it might be like a half of the colony there too. But that's yet to be like completely finalized. So yeah, definitely not a great situation all around.
It's certainly heartbreaking with the avian flu and the problems I've had in Europe, even with the domestic poultry and turkeys, chickens, etc. It's been devastating, and it's something we've really got to keep an eye on for the future. Any more questions, anybody?
There's a couple more in the chat I noticed.
Oh, can you pull them up? Sorry.
Ken had one. I don't think I answered. Yeah, so his question was just if there's any evidence that prey fish might attempt to move further north with warming water, and thus colonies may try to nest further north. So they've kind of seen that in Europe. So I don't know, in the last 10 or so years, there's been one colony that got established in the Arctic Circle on this island called Bear Island. It's part of Norway. And there has been a few other colonies being established on that northern sort of extent in Norway. And there's been sort of an alignment seen there with mackerel populations moving further north due to temperature constraints, pretty much in the same time frame. So there was research that mackerel were moving up further north, and at the same time you have these colonies being established further north. So you might end up seeing that in North America in the years to come too, certainly.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm going to go where the food is. Cool. Any more questions, everybody?
I think Emily had one too at the end.
Sorry.
I wasn't specific, so she was just asking if there was if we were seeing any shifts in the size of prey being brought in. She says some other seabird colonies in the Bay of Fundy have noticed decreasing prey sizes in the late season, especially this past breeding season. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get that many diet samples in the last few years, and especially with gannets, you need to get it from them. Like it doesn't, it's not visible in the bill like with a murre or a puffin. So they sort of hold it in their mouth. And it's really difficult, I found, to get prey samples from gannets, because you basically have to walk up to them and make them like throw it up out of fear. It's not really easy. There's several times I tried to collect some samples and they just kind of flew off and didn't leave any gifts. So yeah, unfortunately I can't answer that.
Okay. Wow. Fascinating, Carl. Really appreciate the presentation. Very informative and concerning as well. Concerning. But if nobody's got any more questions, we'll think about winding things up. Thanks everybody for coming this evening. Apologies for the technical glitches here and there. It's my lack of Zoom skill than anything else. And really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and keep checking out the Facebook page and the website for updates on up and coming meetings. I do appreciate it, everybody. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
No problem, buddy. Look forward to seeing you in the field.
I'm sure sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Spring migration's coming. Hallelujah. 25 days. Okay, good night. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Kyle.
Good night.
Good night, folks.
Take care.
Good night, everyone.